Thank you for joining today's webinar, Is Pregnancy Scanning My Ewes Worth It? My name's Jodie Brizet-O'Brien and I'm one of the Sheep Connect SA team. Tonight's presenter is Hamish Dickson. Hamish is the Principal Consultant for AgriPartner Consulting and has over 15 years of experience in the agricultural industry, working in roles both on-farm and off-farm. Hamish has a specialist knowledge in both extensive and intensive ruminant production system and works in the industry through consulting, training and research, both in sheep and cattle nutrition and management. At this time, I'll hand over to Hamish, who'll talk to us on Is Pregnancy Scanning My Ewes Worth It? Thanks, Hamish.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Welcome everybody. Thanks for jumping online tonight. We're going to spend some time to go through some discussion around pregnancy scanning. It's effectively off the back of an MLA and AWI project, which is nearing completion, has been running for a couple of years now, looking at a whole range of components within, pregnancy scanning, from looking at pregnancy scanners and how we can improve the way that they work and resources available for them, as well as looking at the economic studies of really what's the cost benefit of pregnancy scanning within farming enterprises as well. And then the final stages of the project, which we're sort of nearing now, is looking at how do we implement pregnancy scanning within businesses best, and what are the ranges of ways that it can be implemented as well. So we're going to go through some of that information. There'll be a number of resources that will be available in the coming months as this project is completed, including a number of business case documents that will basically provide some information around how pregnancy scanning may be worthwhile in different sheep enterprises across the country. There'll be the results of the full economic study, which we'll touch on a little bit tonight, and a number of other resources available for pregnancy scanners as well. But I guess going back a little step around where the project started was, I think we're all certainly aware of the growth in push for reproduction and improving reproductive rates within sheep enterprises across Australia. And part of that is we certainly realise that reproduction is one of our key profit drivers. Certainly in maternal and composite and meat-focused enterprises, it's obviously one of the biggest profit drivers we can have, but certainly still in dual purpose or even wool-focused enterprises, it's a pretty important component of those businesses. The biggest opportunities that we still see is generally around improving lamb survival, and particularly for trying to focus on picking up survival rates in twins and multiple births. Big part of that is looking at the management and the nutritional needs of our twin and multiple bearing ewes. And realistically then, the step that follows on from that is how do we identify those animals, and clearly that's where pregnancy scanning comes into play. That's kind of the step back from that is, okay, well, if we're pushing for reproduction, what are the tools and the information that we need to support that? And pregnancy scanning can play a role in that. There's certainly other areas that we can look at as well, but we're obviously going to be focusing on the pregnancy scanning aspect of that today. The next step that really came out of that was there's been a number of surveys that have been completed looking at really the adoption of pregnancy scanning within sheep enterprises, and the number of producers who are pregnancy scanning is realistically fairly low. We're looking at results here from a fairly large survey of nearly 600 producers, and looking at those results, it's looking at 30% of sheep producers were scanning for litter size. Okay, so nearly 70% of producers don't scan for litter size is the other way to look at that. And the main reasons for people who aren't scanning, and particularly aren't scanning at all, is that they see that there isn't a strong business case in implementing pregnancy scanning, or they have limitations, sort of practical limitations around how they might have enough paddocks to support the different mobs that are created, or practical limitations around perhaps creating more water points if they're going to be subdividing paddocks, or simply that they're satisfied with their current performance. I think, to me, realistically, even those last two dot points effectively point to they don't see value in it. So at the end of the day, the main reason that we're looking at that we don't have, we're not implementing pregnancy scanning in businesses, and largely even the results are pointing to, okay, we don't see enough value and we think the business case is not strong enough to bring in pregnancy scanning, and obviously the work and the effort and the activities that are involved in that. So the project that was initiated in August 2019 was really looking at how do we increase lambing percentage through better use of pregnancy scanning. And it was looking at ways that we can overcome some of those barriers to adoption of pregnancy scanning. So a big part of that was really looking at the economics of it and redoing some of the studies that have been done before, expanding the range of enterprises and regions to really better understand, well, what is the cost benefit of pregnancy scanning? A big part of that is yes, we want to know, okay, for every dollar invested, how much are we getting back? But it's then, okay, well, how do we practically implement it? And can I implement that in our enterprise, given all the other things that are going on farm, especially if there's multiple enterprises being run? So that was an important part of the project, and that's a big part of what we're going to talk about tonight. The other part of the project was really working with pregnancy scanners to help really understand some of the needs and challenges faced by scanners and help to build a resource base for them too, to try and improve their ability to deliver a good service to producers as well. So that's a big part of what's been going on in the background of this project too. So as we sort of have been working through, there's been some report looking at basically scanning rate and lambing rate and looking at how much agreement there are between those two figures, looking at engaging with pregnancy scanners. So a lot of these works have been looking at how we work with pregnancy scanners to deliver really good records, and some of those have been about helping to provide training resources for scanners, and equally helping to provide resources for the communication between scanners and producers as well, to make sure that as producers we can ensure that our sheep are presented in the best way possible for scanners to do their job well. Economic analyses have been completed, and there's a number of other project tasks around working with some producer groups, including Merino Link in New South Wales, the big group who many of you will be familiar with, as well as McKillop down in the southeast. The business case documents have been a progression of the economic analysis, and that's looking at basically putting together some resources around the economic outputs, but more importantly, how we actually utilise that information within a business practically. So we'll go through some of that tonight. And then there's a number of extension activities that are involved within the project, and that's obviously part of tonight. And there's been a number of other extension activities from workshops and seminars with producers, as well as pregnancy scanners and consultants as well. So that's a bit of an overview of the project and where some of this information is coming from. Now what I really want to be able to do is to spend some time going into the actual information from the project itself. The economic analysis that was completed as part of this project was realistically at a high level just wanting to work out, right, what's our return on investment of pregnancy scanning within sheep enterprises. There was 3 enterprise types that were looked at, with a merino, self-replacing merino system, merino with a percentage to our terminal size, as well as a maternal composite type. There is different times of lambing and different season types, which is effectively looking at how long the growing season is, in some ways looking at what rainfall patterns are like. So there's a range of results there that basically show what the average return is per ewe. So all of the components of pregnancy scanning in terms of the cost side of the equation were done at full contract rate, including having labour available in terms of bringing stock in for mustering and keeping stock up to the pregnancy scanner, and obviously contract rates for the pregnancy scanning activity itself. So this is the overall benefit per ewe of pregnancy scanning that we see. So there's a range here, and when the project is completed shortly, the full economic results in terms of the background to this will be available for you to have a look at and to go through around the assumptions behind it. But basically what we're sort of looking at is the overall average is that we've got $5.75 average return per ewe. So that's the net benefit of pregnancy scanning across sheep enterprises, across a range of time of lambing, seasons, and enterprise type. Those numbers were completed on 5-year average prices. It is more favourable at the moment if you look at the prices for the last year or two. That dollar figure of $5.75 goes up closer to $10. But in terms of sort of looking at long-term average prices, that's the overall outcome that we're getting. Certainly what we tend to find is that the shorter the growing season, and equally the more opportunity there is to turn off dry or lower performing animals prior to major feed shortage windows, then we improve those results. And these results are coming through from certainly better management of dries, improved management of our multiple bearing ewes in terms of more targeted nutrition, more targeted lambing management around paddock selection, shelter. But there's also things about considerations around potentially better managing our replacement animals too. So we'll go into all of those details, but this is basically the outcome, the summary outcome of the economic analysis from the pregnancy scanning project. So like I say, there'll be some more resources, and when this is all published, I'm sure we'll be able to get that information and the full reports circulated, potentially through Sheep Connect with Jodie's support. The next step on from this was taking this information to be able to see, okay, well, if we look at pregnancy scanning, and in this scenario, we're looking at pregnancy scanning for multiples, and if we can say, okay, well, look, broadly, we know we're creating an economic benefit out of pregnancy scanning. It's how do we actually take that information and then implement it on farm? And that was really the next stage of looking at, well, how do we create some business case documents to take the economic information a step further and bring it into what are the practical aspects of pregnancy scanning? Are there limitations? Are there side benefits that we need to be thinking about? And then importantly, it's taking the economic results and understanding how they will fit, or how pregnancy scanning will fit within your enterprise, and the information that you'll get from it, and what's the cost benefit like on your particular place. And that's a step that's really up to all of us as producers to do individually, and understand how we can extract the most value out of it. So the business case documents that we'll go through in a minute were really the next progression to build on the economic study that John Young has done, and to really look at how we can implement it. There were 3 business case documents that were developed out of that. One was looking at what's the benefits in terms of pregnancy scanning for pregnancy status alone. So what we normally look at is terms of just wet and dry. 2 was pregnancy scanning for litter size. So identifying not just wet, dry, but identifying dry, single, twins, or maybe multiples. And the 3rd was looking at more broadly the more broad benefits of looking at pregnancy scanning in businesses. So there's a whole lot of other aspects there that are worth considering that we'll talk about in a short while too. These business case documents were intended really, and when you see them, it's about looking at what are the broad benefits of pregnancy scanning, how can you bring them in. They're not designed to be specific to a particular region or a particular rainfall pattern, or just to say, hey, look, this is how it's going to work in the Clare Valley or the Southeast. It's more about understanding how do we actually look at pregnancy scanning at a high level. How can we implement it on our place, and what are the benefits that we get out of it? So in terms of pregnancy scanning for preg status, if you're not doing this, it's really just looking at pregnancy scanning for wet and dry. So we're just getting information in this scenario of which animals are pregnant and which ones have not conceived. There's no information about how many lambs a pregnant ewe has. It's just understanding who's dry and who's pregnant. For many producers, this is a first step into pregnancy scanning. If you haven't done it before, there's a process around just learning, okay, how do we present sheep for scanning? What information do we get back? How do we practically implement it on farm? And all of that is a learning step. And for many producers, sometimes just pregnancy scanning for wet dry is a great first step in that. Clearly, it doesn't usually end up creating too many mobs. So practically, it's quite manageable on farm. And depending on your pregnancy scanning contractor, you may well scan a portion of those animals for multiples, just to start getting a feel for how many might be carrying multiple births as well, and start to get those thoughts ticking about, hey, maybe next year do I need to be thinking about scanning for litter size as well. But the big benefits out of this type of strategy is certainly you can target nutrition to those animals that are pregnant far more closely to those that are dry. You open up potentially sale options, obviously, for your dry animals. So those dry animals may well get one more potential chance at joining next year, or they may be culled in that year. Those sorts of decisions are something that can be reviewed depending on how the season's going. And once you get into a cycle of pregnancy scanning every year, then you may well find that you're looking at twice dry animals being your candidates for culling. One of the big things that comes up is occasionally we have, fairly large joining failures in a particular mob or even across a bigger flock if that's the case. And certainly pregnancy scanning is a risk management tool that many producers use just to identify any issues like that before they've got to the point of their normal lambing and realise that something's gone wrong. It gives you an opportunity to potentially remate before you're well outside of your normal lambing season, or well outside of a time when you just can't make any other adjustment to your direction at that point in time. So there are benefits in terms of pregnancy scanning for status, and like I say, it's quite often a progression towards looking at pregnancy scanning for multiples down the track as well. Typically, the greatest benefit out of pregnancy scanning for status is generally when you can better manage your dries. From an economic perspective, there's a cost benefit there. The average in the economic study was $3.30 per ewe. So you can sort of see the difference from what we were looking at before of an overall average of $5.75 for scanning for multiples. We dropped down a bit to just scanning for pregnancy status alone. But in the same way, the greatest benefit that you can achieve economically for scanning for preg status alone is normally in flocks, sort of autumn and winter lambing flocks, where you can really drop your feed consumption of animals by getting rid of the dries before you have your main feed deficit. So there's considerations there around how that plays out. What you do with those dries, and particularly for sale dries, is a little bit dependent on your enterprise and season. Certainly some merino producers may well think about whether they wait for a normal shearing time to get the wool off those ewes before they're sold, or depending on what the markets are like for skin prices, then maybe they go straight away. So there's plenty of options to be sort of thinking about how you manage those dry animals as well. So typically the next sort of scenario is looking at, well, do we pregnancy scan for multiples as well? So scanning for litter size. So we get information on which ewes haven't conceived, so a dry. We get information on which ewes are carrying single, a twin, a triplet. And sometimes basically those twins and triplets are grouped together just to create a multiple group. So we certainly still get that information about which animals are dry, which ones are pregnant. So our dry management of those ewes can still be very similar to what we'd be looking at if we were just pregnancy scanning for status of the two. But it allows us to certainly target our management of the pregnant ewes far more closely. And the big reason for that is that if we're trying to push for higher reproductive rates, then we know that our twin lamb survival rates are one of the big areas that we have room for improvement in. And a big part of that is the nutritional demand of multiple bearing ewes. Right, their requirements for energy and protein are significantly higher than singles, and understanding which ones require high levels of energy and protein versus those that require a lower level is pretty important in terms of being able to, at the very least, be able to allocate lambing paddocks in a better way depending on their demand. And certainly sort of the next stage on is understanding, well, are we meeting energy intake requirements? Do we need to provide some level of supplementation to our multiples depending on the season, and really target our ideal condition score for those ewes to really maximise lamb survival in our multiple bearing groups. That's the sorts of pathways that many producers are taking to try and get the lamb survival rates up in twin bearing ewes. One of the benefits of scanning is actually going back a step and really just being able to understand what the losses are of singles and twins. Without that information, it's actually really hard to understand where the potential gains are. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but really being able to target that management of the multiples is a pretty critical step to improving lamb survival, and it's something that we need pregnancy scanning for to be able to really target that much more closely. The big differential management discussion around, say, single and twin bearing ewes is typically around nutrition, but the other big part that we need to be thinking about is paddock allocations at lambing time. We know there's strong correlations between shelter, between aspect, between privacy, and those sorts of things that will affect lamb survival. It affects lambing behaviour, and certainly our single bearing ewes are far more resilient to adverse conditions than what our multiple bearing ewes are. So understanding which group of ewes are carrying multiples. Yes, we can target nutrition, which is great, but it actually also allows us to target and allocate our better paddocks in terms of shelter and feed and aspect, so that we can really still maximise lamb survival rates from those parts too. So part of those considerations are all within some of those cost benefits too. So overall, as we've looked at before, we're looking at that $5.75 average return per ewe when we're managing ewes for litter size. So understanding the multiples that are within the system too. Maximising lamb survival through better management of our ewes is an important part, and it's what we predominantly use pregnancy scanning for. But one of the other things that's actually worth discussing is what are the other ways that we can gain value from pregnancy scanning. And I touched on this before, but it's worth really sort of digging into a little bit more. Is quite often one of our first steps as producers is trying to figure out how do we improve lamb survival. And I think one of the most common questions I get consulting is, right, where do we focus? How are we going to improve marking rates? The first question I then tend to come back with is, okay, well, where's your current performance level? And then it opens up a discussion about, okay, well, what's our current marking rate? And someone might say, right, well, look, we're marking 100%, which is good. And then it's okay, well, if we're going to improve that, where do we focus our time and attention? So the natural question or the natural progression in the thought from there is, okay, well, if we're going to improve it, where are the current losses occurring? Are we actually conceiving 160 or 70% and only marking 100%? In which case we know we're getting really high lamb survival problems or issues in the system. Or if we're marking 100%, but in reality we're only conceiving 110%, then that changes very much where our focus is in terms of management to try and bring overall lambing rates up. So having information from pregnancy scanning about really what is the potential of the flock versus what is the actual result allows us to focus our time and attention on where we can improve the operation. So that's a really critical step, that even if you have an overall target of improving your lambing rate, we have to have that information to be able to really target our focus. Because if we're going to look at, okay, well, look, our conception rates are too low, well, that's a very different change to management program than issues at the lambing end of the spectrum about making sure that we've got better lamb survival rates for those that hit the ground. So understanding those fetal losses between scanning and marking time is a really critical piece of information that we can gain from pregnancy scanning. And it's a pretty important thing to be thinking about if improving reproductive rates overall within your enterprise is part of your business objectives. Understanding pregnancy scanning can also help in terms of assessing replacement ewes. So if you're breeding your own replacements, if you're a self-replacing system, then having some information on those ewe lambs about were they potentially born as a twin or were they born as a single, then can help just clarify a little bit of the selection around, well, yep, we've got this group of ewes that are coming through that may well be potentially a little bit lighter in body weight, but that may well be because that ewe lamb's been reared as a twin and hasn't had, a supply of milk from mum that a single lamb has had. So it may not completely change your selection criteria, but when you've got that animal in the classing crate and you're looking at her and going, is she good on all factors except a little bit of live weight? Or if you can see that she is actually born as a twin, or at least born out of a twin mob, then it may well just be that little piece of information that helps make a slightly more accurate assessment of whether that ewe is potentially a good replacement for your system or not. Clearly, it won't guarantee that she was reared as a twin, but you will know whether she was conceived and potentially born as a twin, at least anyway. And that sort of information can be fairly easily collected. If we're pregnancy scanning and we are differentially managing our single and twin bearing ewes, we're lambing those groups down separately. Come marking time, it's really just about keeping a track of which sequence number tags have been used for which different mobs of marking time, and that's one relatively simple way of tracking some data against our lambs about whether they were part of a multiple mob or whether they were born to single bearing ewes. Information that can be collected as part of electronic tags can certainly make some of those sorts of processes a little bit easier, and certainly at pregnancy scanning time that may be part of the logistics of that, and we'll touch on that in a second. The other piece of information that some producers are collecting at pregnancy scanning time or using at pregnancy scanning time is, yes, understanding whether a ewe is dry or carrying a single or multiple bearing or multiple lambs, but also some pregnancy scanners are offering fetal aging. So looking at basically the fetus size and giving an estimate of whether it's potentially in the early, middle or late, or sometimes just early and late period of your lambing window. So that information can be used quite practically on farm in many ways. Lots of people may well use it to try and improve labour efficiency. So having an understanding of which group of ewes are all expected to lamb early, so maybe within the first 2 or 3 weeks of the lambing window, versus those that are going to lamb in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the lambing period, can allow you to just manage those two groups quite separately. So you may well keep them separate. You may lamb one group in a different area. That allows you to make sure that if you're doing lambing checks, you know the groups of animals that are most critical to monitor at which time throughout the lambing window. So you may well focus your time and attention on, the 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 mobs that are all earlies, and you know that realistically all the late mobs you don't need to be too worried about for another couple of weeks. Depending on your joining period, so if you have, say, 6-week joining, there are some ways, and we do this on our place, is we can scan, some scanners will do early, middle and late and break that lambing window up into 2-week blocks. And clearly there's a little bit of crossover in sort of the edge of each of those windows. No one's perfect, and just judging by size, it's never a day-to-day split in those sorts of groups, but certainly you can get the majority of animals into each group. And it may be that it allows you to utilise lambing paddocks more efficiently. So in our system, for example, and we've seen it at a number of properties now, the early and lates can in some ways almost utilise the same lambing paddocks. It gives you an opportunity to put the early lambing ewes through as soon as the last lambs have hit the deck, drift them off, hopefully to some paddocks nearby that might be, they might be sown down to a forage crop or just have alternate feed available for them. Give those paddocks a short rest, it's only going to be a week or two, and then bring the lates through to lamb down and utilise those paddocks. So it may be that if you've got particular areas that are really great for lambing, that have best shelter and the best feed, then in some ways you might have an opportunity to get 2 cracks at it with those early and lates. Clearly the middles are going to be elsewhere. And the proportions of animals that you have in the early and lates or the early, middle, late groups is going to change depending on potentially how the season is, what condition those ewes are in and how they've joined up. In many systems, we hope that the vast majority of them are in that early to middle window of time. The other area that sometimes having some information on fetal age out of pregnancy scanning can be useful is just slightly targeting things like marking. So, if you've got early and late groups, then certainly you know that, marking wise, you might be able to mark all the early groups a few weeks ahead of all of the late groups. So there's some practical ways that some of that information can be used too. So there's sort of a whole range of ways that pregnancy scanning is utilised on farm. We've talked about everything from sort of using it for wet dry, all the way through to managing multiples, and then clearly there at the end looking at fetal aging, which is the pointy end of it as well. But it's important to sort of understand really where the range of ways that it can be used is, so that we can start thinking about really the opportunities. And I think if you've got that information at hand, as you go through lambings, you'll start to think, okay, well, maybe there's an opportunity to do this aspect or change this aspect of our management on farm. And if you understand the opportunities there, then that's step one. The implementation of pregnancy scanning is the next big question and the next big thing to be thinking about. I think the logical progression is going, okay, well, yep, we can see potentially we've got an economic benefit of pregnancy scanning. Secondly, how will we implement pregnancy scanning on farm? To what degree are we going to implement it? Are we going to scan for multiples and manage our multiple bearing ewes in a particular area of the farm and feed them a particular way? But then it's about how do we implement it? And what are the logistics of getting that information? If, for example, we are looking at pregnancy scanning and managing multiples, the really important things to be thinking about is, okay, so even prior to pregnancy scanning, how do we actually book the pregnancy scanner in at the right time? How long has our joining window been? Can we pregnancy scan at the right time to make sure that we get good information on which ewes are carrying multiples, which ewes are carrying singles, which ewes are potentially dry? And how are we going to manage those animals out of the pregnancy scanning crate? Right, you've got data on those animals now. How are we going to manage them? So they may well just get drafted into groups on the day of pregnancy scanning. So it's thinking about, okay, well, where are we going to manage them? How are we going to keep them separate? If they get boxed, how are we going to identify them? If you're using things like electronic ID, who's going to record that data on the animals? Is the pregnancy scanning contractor going to do it for you? Potentially, are they just going to draft them into groups and then you need to scan them and record that information on which ones are dry and which ones are carrying singles, which ones are multiples? So understanding how we record that information, how we manage those groups on farm, and then potentially looking at that data after pregnancy scanning to then start planning towards lambing time and thinking about, okay, well, we've got this number of singles, this number of twins, how many moms are we going to split them up into, how many paddocks are we going to need, and how are we going to utilise that information for this lambing time, but potentially how are we also going to utilise that information in future lambings as well to potentially give us some information about ewes that have either been dry 2 times and whether there's an opportunity to cull those animals. And likewise, there might be some opportunities down the track in terms of having successive joining records on those animals that if we are looking at culling ewes, then can we actually utilise their preg status as one of the decision points in culling as well? So it might be that if conditions get tight, we have a dry period, well, rather than necessarily just looking at a particular age group and getting rid of some of the older ewes or whichever age group is potentially on the chopping block, then is there actually some information where we can go through and say, okay, well, look, there's a group of ewes here that have been dry once and only reared us a few singles, then maybe they're our first candidates to be looking at in terms of culls. And likewise, you may well find at the other end of the spectrum that some of the older ewes, it might be a decision that there's actually some really good older ewes that have consistently scanned twins that are still sound in the mouth, still carrying good condition, and realistically could still potentially stay on the farm for another year. They're your proven performers and the ewes that are clearly going well in your enterprise, and potentially there's an opportunity to keep them in the system a little bit longer and let them perform for you. So really going that next step in terms of understanding how we're going to implement it on farm, what are the benefits, what are the costs is the next step. So there's plenty to work through in that step. So out of this project, there'll be a number of resources that will work through that information. There'll be, I guess, discussion points around a lot of the stuff that we've talked about tonight to help refresh your memory and to help work through all of those considerations as part of potentially implementing pregnancy scanning on farm. So, Jodie, I think with that, it's probably time for a few questions and I'm happy to go from there.
Excellent, thank you. Just a reminder, if you've got a question, pop it in the Q&A box or in the chat box and send it through. Hamish, this one's one from a producer saying, and this comment is, my scanner can only do wet dries. So where do I go to from here to go to multiples?
So one is, I guess, have a chat with the scanner and encourage them that you're looking for information on multiples within the flock, and that hopefully they can offer that service in the future. So it takes time for scanners to learn the art of pregnancy scanning. So if they're new and they're still I guess learning the skills, then it takes time for them just to do wet dry to start with, and then hopefully they gradually pick up skills in terms of doing multiples. So that's certainly a discussion point that's worth having with your scanner. But outside of that, look, there are a number of scanners available throughout the state that can offer pregnancy scanning to basically deliver dry, single, twin, triplets. So that's the other avenue of that. But I think, as an industry, we are probably implementing pregnancy scanning more and more, and I think we need to encourage, pregnancy scanners to deliver us a service that we need. And some of that is looking at, being able to scan for multiples. And it might be that if you're looking at being able to utilise electronic ID within the flock, that they can offer that as part of that data collection service. It's an opportunity. You've got them in the yards. They're going through a crate. Ideally, we can collect as much information as we can at that point in time.
Yep, no, that's a great point. And I guess the other thing, if people are talking to their scanners, direct them to this project if they haven't heard about it, to get some more information.
Yep, absolutely.
So who's the best contact there?
So Forbes Brian. Yeah, so Forbes Brian at the University of Adelaide is the project leader. Or likewise, get in touch with me and I can forward them on. But there's a number of resources that will be available for pregnancy scanners out of this project, including some imagery. So being able to give preg scanners some resources around, okay, look, here's a range of images that certainly at a very basic level can show singles and twins, but also looking at things like fetal health, being able to have some good resources about, hey, look, maybe this is what a fetus looks like that is having problems and may not survive, or this is a healthy fetus. So all those sorts of things are part of what's coming out of the project. Not my particular area of expertise, but something that I think is probably really important for our industry. So there's some good information there that'll be available for scanners too.
Excellent. Question here from one of the producers: how hereditary is multiple birthing ewes?
So the heritability of a lot of our reproductive traits is low, but what is slightly different is the repeatability. So that's what we're looking for often in those situations is, can we actually find animals that are consistently, ideally, pregnancy scanning for twins, and likewise the dries are often in there for the second time. So typically what we find, obviously like many things in nature, the genetic background of those animals influences things, but if you're taking out animals that are twice dry, you typically see a 5 to 10% improvement in weaning rate. So that's what we're looking for. But yes, fair question, and that's always one of the comments that comes up is the core heritability of many of the reproductive traits is quite low, but we're looking at what the repeatability is too.
Okay. Another question here: is there a set time to scan for fetal age, or can it be done in the scan for multiples window?
They can do it within the scan for multiples window. So the best thing I can say with that is, as soon as the rams come out, get on the phone to your pregnancy scanner to get them on board with what your dates are, and book a time in for scanning. Like everything, I'm sure all pregnancy scanners have their ideal date of when they would, in the perfect world, love to come and scan the ewes, given how far along pregnancy they are. Typically it's about 35, 40 days after the rams come out, but it depends a little bit on how long your mating period is. But if it's a typical sort of 5 or 6 week joining, you're looking at about that sort of 40 days after the rams come out. But I would say over the top of that, work with your pregnancy scanner to make sure that they've got it ideal for them, and in that way, then it's you working with your pregnancy scanner to make sure that you're giving them every opportunity to deliver the result that you want. That they want to be able to say, okay, look, this is where they're up to pregnancy wise. I'm going to come on the 14th of June. That's our perfect date. Let's lock it in for then. And that also hopefully opens up a discussion with your pregnancy scanner about preparation of ewes. So quite often it's bringing them in the night before. The last thing that pregnancy scanners want a full sheep in the yards. You're not going to get a good result out of that. So, have a discussion with the pregnancy scanner about, okay, well, how do we prepare everything well for them to do their job? Potentially, do they need someone to help push up in the yards? All those factors are part of it, and how potentially everything from a pregnancy scanning crate is going to fit your yard system. They're all sort of thoughts that are good to have a discussion with early on, rather than finding a problem on the morning of pregnancy scanning.
Yep. Another question here, which sort of flows on for the last one, is with the 6-week mating, when's the best time to preg test ewes?
Yeah, so basically I'd keep in mind about that sort of 40 days after the rams come out. So that's your guide. But yeah, following on from that, as soon as the rams come out, ring up the preg scanner and say, hey, this is where we're at. Can you book us in? You can certainly speak with them beforehand as well, and just get it all lined up fully. The one thing just to watch is that I think many a producer have been caught out booking in pregnancy scanning based on intended joining times, and if joining goes on for an extra week because of whatever reason, then you may get to the situation where there's a few late ewes that haven't been picked up properly because pregnancy scanning's been a fraction too early for them or something like that. So quite often, many pregnancy scanners will want to know, when did joining start, but also when did the rams come out, and they can find the best time within that window or within that sort of overall mating period to go, okay, well, look, on average, this is when we're going to be able to scan to pick up everything from the start of the joining window through to the end.
Yep. Great advice. And if you haven't got a lambing planner, little green cards from AWI, catch up with me when you next see me at a Sheep Connect event and grab one, because that'll certainly help with your planning. Another question here, Hamish, how early should ewe lambs be weaned and therefore have time to recover for conception for the next time round? So it's probably ewe lambs and ewes I would put in that question. Yeah.
So basically we're generally looking at about an average of a sort of a 12-week lamb. So that typically will end up at about sort of 14 weeks after the start of lambing, depending on how long your lambing window is and when, typically when the majority of those ewes have joined up. But you expect that certainly the majority of ewes have joined within the first, say, 3 to 4 weeks. Then about 12 weeks after the start of lambing is our typical sort of weaning period. So that gives those ewes time to probably give as much milk production as they're going to those lambs, and likewise those lambs after 10, 12, and especially for the early ones that are sort of 14 weeks by that stage, a period of time on mum that they can hopefully get value from her, but equally staying on much longer, typically they're not going to get much value out of milk production because milk production certainly waned right off by that stage. So that's the standard. And then you vary it from there potentially on season. So if it's a disastrous season and feed-wise we're limited, ewe condition is down, any of those sorts of factors, well, realistically the ewes might be limiting milk production anyway, so there's an opportunity to take the lambs off and wean earlier, especially if you're potentially trying to join as ewe lambs where you need every day to be maximising growth rate to be able to try and hit high live weight targets for potential ewe lambing joining. So in those sorts of scenarios, you may be early weaning all the way down to 8 weeks. So there's a discussion probably just around that aspect, which is the varying that decision based on season a little bit too.
Excellent, thank you. I'd just like to thank everyone who's joined us for today's webinar. Hamish, thank you for sharing your insight and expertise. Just a reminder that tonight's webinar was recorded and it will be uploaded to the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel in the coming days. We welcome you to revisit the webinar yourself or share it with your colleagues, farmers and family. If you've got any more questions you think about over the coming days, contact us directly using the contact information on your webinar registration, and I'll forward those through to Hamish. I thank you for your time and have a lovely evening.